April 7, 1945. Clear skies over Tokyo Bay. The Japanese high command still relied on an old dogma. No American fighter would have the range to threaten the imperial capital. General Shigeru Sawada, a military advisor to the cabinet, had said days earlier that distance is our greatest ally. He was not alone in this belief. For Japanese strategists, 750 miles of open sea was a natural barrier. Until that morning. Because that morning, the sound that pierced the clouds was not that of a lone bomber nor of a suicide attack. It was the lilting sound of 650 caliber machine guns sweeping through the Empire's airspace. The P-51 Mustang, a single-engine American fighter, crossed the horizon as a metallic messenger of the industrial age. Flying in formation over Mount Fuji, they heralded a new kind of warfare, fueled by logistics, engineering, and gasoline refined in Texas. This is the account of when Japan's skies were dominated not by bombs, but by statistics. When experienced pilots looked up and couldn't believe what they saw, and when what was considered impossible simply flew over their heads. But before we dive into the technical details, there's one statistic that sets the tone for everything to come. In 1945, the United States produced more P-51 Mustangs in a single year than Japan had managed to manufacture of fighters of all types during the previous 2 years combined. For Americans, it was just another shift in the factories. For the Japanese, it was the collapse of a faith that courage and sacrifice were enough. And when Mustangs loomed over Tokyo, it wasn't just the sound of propellers that filled the sky. It was the sound of calculation replacing hope. If you value stories like this, where numbers explain the end of empires and machines reveal the limits of bravery, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps this channel to continue documenting what memory cannot forget. On the morning of April 7, 1945, at the first light of day over Tokyo Bay, the shadow of Mount Fuji served as a silent beacon for a force that was not supposed to be there. 91 U.S. Army Air Force P-51 Mustangs crossed the ocean in tight formation, aligning their compasses with the permanent white of Japan's sacred mountain. The rendezvous point with the B-29 bombers had been precisely timed. Navigation by estimation, 110-gallon auxiliary tanks launched into the sea as they crossed the coast. The Japanese pilots of the 56th Sentai, radioed to the enemy presence, went up believing they found only the giant silver bombers that had already become a tragic presence in the home sky. What they saw paralyzed them. Instead of slow, unprotected bombers, dozens of single-engine fighters flew with authority over the imperial capital. For years, its commanders had ensured that an American fighter could never fly that far. It was not a hypothesis. It was a doctrinal certainty. The visual surprise quickly turned into a moral shock. How could they be there? How had they traversed more than 1,200 miles of open sea with a single engine? The answer was technical, not magical. Mustangs flew with Packard Merlin engines, British derivatives adapted to the American production scale. They were agile, lethal, reliable, and now they were meters from the imperial palace. The testimony recorded years later by Japanese pilot Tetsuzo Iwamizu reveals the incredulity of that moment. I saw the white star under the wing and thought it was an illusion. The sky I swore to defend was no longer ours. We were fighting ghosts. But those ghosts were fed by data. Each P-51 carried 650 caliber machine guns with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, totaling nearly 2,000 rounds per aircraft. They had a flight range of more than 2,400 kilometers and fuel efficiency that allowed air patrols over Japan with a safe margin of return. But the most brutal data was yet to come. By April 1945, the United States had manufactured more than 8,000 D-model Mustangs, more than the total output of all Japanese fighters combined in the previous 2 years. As Japan struggled to keep planes in the air, the United States was launching a new Mustang every 66 minutes. A production line in Englewood, California, and another in Dallas, Texas operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If this data impressed you, comment below with the phrase, "Logistics wins," because in that moment, it wasn't just the sound of engines that filled the air over Tokyo. It was the sound of spreadsheets, engineers, and workers winning the battlefield before they even fired a shot. For Japanese pilots, reality collided with ideology. American fighters were no longer an unlikely chance of attack. They were a constant. And with them came the silent promises of modern industry, repetition, standardization, predictability. What Japan had sacrificed in the name of the spirit, the United States elevated to science. The Mustang wasn't just an airplane, it was a solved equation, and the brutal logic of this equation would still be felt in the following weeks, because what started with surprise would soon become routine. And soon, the Japanese sky itself would cease to be national territory, becoming technically an American corridor. But the real impact of this supremacy would only be understood in the analysis of what sustained those flights. Not just extra tanks and supercharged engines, but an entire invisible chain of fuel, ammunition, parts, and people. And that's exactly what we'll see next. How the silent monster of American production lines made every mission look like a miracle, when in fact, it was just applied math on an industrial scale. The P-51 Mustang was not designed in temples, nor was it designed by ancestral ideologies. It was born from drawing boards, wind tunnel testing, assembly lines, and efficiency spreadsheets. It was the materialization of a mechanical logic, mass-produced as if it were a household appliance, but flying at 700 km/h over millennial empires. Its heart was the Packard Phi 1657 engine, a licensed version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, manufactured with American precision, a V12 in V, liquid-cooled, with 1,720 horsepower in an emergency regime. But its real weapon was the two-stage, two-speed supercharger, which maintained power even at altitudes where Japanese engines choked. The result was a brutal advantage. While the Axis interceptors lost steam above 6,000 meters, the Mustang remained stable and aggressive at 10,000. The fuselage, long and thin, married a laminar flow wing, an aerodynamic innovation designed by Edgar Schmude, an engineer at North American Aviation. This wing, unlike conventional profiles, kept the airflow adherent over a larger area, reducing parasitic drag by up to 35%. This not only saved fuel, it gave the fighter range and speed that confounded the enemy's calculations. With supplemental disposable tanks, the Mustang could fly 2,400 kilometers and still fight for 30 minutes. It was therefore a strategic predator, capable of crossing oceans and returning even though it was single-engine. The 6-wing-mounted Browning 50 cannons could fire up to 4,800 rounds per minute. And it wasn't just any fire. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, designed to pierce armor, set tanks on fire, and dismantle engines with surgical precision. This combination of power, range, and reliability turned the P-51 into a logistical phenomenon. But the secret was not only in the machine. It was in the ability to manufacture, maintain, and replicate it. While Japanese factories were forced to operate in caves to escape bombing and faced steel rationing, North American operated at a full industrial pace, with assembly lines running in 3 shifts. Every Mustang was produced with tight tolerances, standardized parts, and predictable maintenance. Any American pilot could get into any P-51 and know exactly how it would behave. In Japan, each aircraft was unique, and often unpredictable. The American standard was both technical and psychological. And this is where the irony begins to deepen. The same nation that the Japanese believed to be decadent, materialistic, and spiritually fragile was producing war machines with a degree of repeatable perfection that Japan, with its artisanal tradition, could not achieve. The doctrine of maximum effort clashed with the philosophy of minimum necessary efficiency. While the Japanese bet everything on each mission, the Americans treated the war as a process, and their fighters as elements of a chain. This chain stretched from Texas to the Pacific, from refineries to refueling bases, from sea convoys to maintenance hangars on Iwo Jima. By April 1945, a single group of American fighters was capable of flying 2 missions a day, fueling, rearming, and redeploying fighters with production line speed. Japan, on the other hand, struggled to keep aircraft in the air for more than a week without breaking some vital component. The Mustang flew not because it was invulnerable, but because every bolt had a place to replace, every engine had a backup, every gun had a maintenance specialist. The war, before it reached the cockpit, was already decided in the foundries, in the industrial projects, and in the ability to feed the machine with 100-octane fuel delivered by tankers, protected by air and naval escort. In 1945, while Japan improvised fuel from pine roots, Mustangs received refined gasoline directly from California. The difference was in the air, literally. And this difference was visible, audible, and above all, measurable. Because it was no longer about bravery, it was a statistic. In a confidential statement reviewed after the war, Japanese Colonel Masataka Ida admitted, "We thought we were prepared, but when I saw the Mustangs flying over Tokyo in perfect formation, I realized we were fighting an industry, not an army." The next part will show exactly how far this industry was willing to go, and how it turned a combat ideal into a mathematical equation that could no longer be won with faith or sacrifice. In Japanese air doctrine, combat was seen as an extension of the ancestral duel, a direct clash between spirits where maneuverability, intuition, and individual courage decided victory. The ideal of the samurai pilot, trained in the tradition of Bushido, fed an almost mystical vision of aerial combat. The plane was an extension of the warrior's soul, and the machine, as important as it was, could never override human determination. For this reason, for much of the war, Japan prioritized light, agile, and extremely maneuverable fighters, such as the A6M0, which had dominated the skies at the beginning of the conflict when they encountered heavier and less responsive opponents. But in 1944, with the increasing pressure of B-29 bombers, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, known to the Allies as Frank, appeared. It was the Japanese answer to modern Allied fighters, a single engine with a 1,990 HP Nakajima Homar radial engine, equipped with heavy armament and a top speed of more than 600 km/h. In theory, the Hayate was the functional equivalent of the P-51D. In practice, it was a promise sabotaged by circumstances. Japanese engineering had finally designed a competitive plane, but without the resources to produce it with quality and consistency. Most Ki-84s delivered between 1944 and 1945 had chronic failures, corrosion in the hydraulic lines, inferior materials in the fuselage, and engines prone to overheating above 20,000 feet. Experienced pilots reported that the aircraft betrayed them in combat, and that the examples varied drastically in performance from each other. While the Americans mass-produced Mustangs with interchangeable parts and standardized maintenance, the Japanese delivered an airplane that depended on luck and available labor. By 1945, much of the Hayate's production was assembled by teenagers, apprentices, and forced laborers under constant threat of bombing. On the other side of the Pacific, American doctrine was not driven by individual honor, but by collective outcome. Aerial combat ceased to be duels and became tactical support functions. An American fighter did not need to win in maneuverability. He needed to fly farther, withstand more damage, carry more ammunition, and return home. The priority was measurable effectiveness, not abstract bravery. Thus, the P-51D was 30% heavier than the Hayate, less agile in horizontal turns, but much more stable at high speeds, superior in dives, and unbeatable in long-duration flights. It withstood more damage, offered better visibility, and had a pressurized cabin with a functional oxygen system, something many Hayates could not guarantee. The clash between these two doctrines produced a kind of brutal irony. Japanese pilots, molded for close combat, found themselves shot down before they could even identify the enemy. Bursts of 50 fired at 400 meters, guided by gyroscopic sights, eliminated the traditional advantage of maneuverability. The duel had been replaced by interception, and in this new air theater, romanticism was defeated by statistics. When Major Shoichi Sugita, one of the top Japanese aces, was shot down by a Mustang without even being able to react, his colleagues did not understand what had happened. It was not a mistake, it was obsolescence. Because heaven had ceased to be an arena of honor, it had become a laboratory, and the Japanese were fighting a doctrine that treated combat as reverse engineering. For the Americans, each mission was analyzed, recorded, and improved with new data. The war flew with spreadsheets in its lap. For the Japanese, the analysis was a moral reflection. Had they been brave enough? Had they given themselves completely? And in this difference of logic, the real abyss resided. The Mustang was cool, reliable, and repeatable. Hayate was passionate, unpredictable, and fragile. A plane shaped by urgency. The other, by mathematics. By the end of 1945, only 3,500 Ki-84s had been produced. Many of them never took off. The P-51D, on the other hand, exceeded 8,000 units in full operation, with complete logistical support. In a July 1945 Japanese internal report, an anonymous officer wrote, "We have good pilots and good designs, but they have production, and in the end, that's what defines heaven." The next installment will show how, even at the highest altitudes where oxygen was scarce and engines screamed, the Mustang still had the upper hand, and how Japan, even with its best men, could no longer breathe in the field where engineering decided everything. At 30,000 feet, combat was no longer fought by men, it was decided by engineering. In the rarefaction of air where oxygen weakens muscles and motors, the advantage belonged not to the bravest, but to the most prepared. The Packard Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger, with intercooler between compression stages, was the game-changer in the P-51D's performance at high altitudes. While conventional engines lost up to 50% of their power above 20,000 feet, the Merlin maintained torque, speed, and response with almost clinical precision. This meant that the Mustang could climb, maintain acceleration, and engage enemies without suffering a drop in performance, even while flying above most Japanese aircraft. The Nakajima Homare radial engine, which equipped the main Japanese interceptors such as the Ki-84, began to demonstrate critical flaws in this operational ceiling. The Homare's rated power, estimated at 1,190 HP, dropped sharply as the plane climbed. Without multi-stage supercharging and with inefficient intercoolers, the engine's thermal system generated overheating, loss of compression, and often complete failures in flight. In direct engagements, the Mustangs attacked from top to bottom, using altitude as a tactical advantage, diving with greater speed, firing steadily, and climbing back up effortlessly, a cycle the Japanese could not repeat. Japanese pilots, accustomed to elbow combat, horizontal maneuvers, and tight turns, were forced to climb up to intercept the B-29 bombers, only to find Mustangs already positioned at higher altitude ready for attack. It was like fighting an enemy that had already arrived first in the arena, with bigger weapons, better breath, and a wider view. There was no room for duels, only for sentences, and the court was the thin air. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Japanese intelligence reports knew of the Merlin engine's capability. They knew how the Mustang was performing, but they underestimated its application on a large scale. They believed that logistics and reach would still limit their presence in the Pacific. They thought that distance would save Tokyo, and it was exactly this miscalculation that allowed Mustangs to fly high, far, and lethal. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this, where war is told inside the gears. Because it wasn't about bravery anymore. It was about thermal resistance, barometric pressure, and controlled combustion in layers of air, where no Zero has ever operated safely. And when the Japanese realized that altitude was non-negotiable, they tried to find answers on the ground, but what they found was even more devastating. Mustangs didn't just win in the sky. They also expired before takeoff. In the next part, we'll look at how the scale of production and the speed of American replacement made each Mustang not just a fighter, but a disposable cog in a much larger machine. And how, for every Japanese plane shot down, another 5 Mustangs were already ready to climb. By this point in the war, the Pacific sky was no longer just a combat space. It was an aerial projection of the assembly line. The P-51 Mustangs, which once seemed like a technological anomaly over Tokyo, now appeared in groups, in waves, in almost mathematical rotations. And that was no coincidence. It was planning, scale, and industrial pace. North American's plant in Inglewood, California, alone produced a full Mustang every 66 minutes. There were 20 fighters a day, operating in 3 shifts, without interruption. At peak production, the United States was manufacturing about 700 Mustangs per month. By the end of the conflict, more than 15,000 units would be produced, the largest fleet of long-range fighters in history. But what scared the Axis generals was not just the volume. It was the constant quality. Each aircraft rolled off the line to the same standards, with interchangeable parts, and underwent tests before being sent to the front. There was no improvisation. There was no shortage. Japan, under constant bombardment, was facing the collapse of the industrial chain. Production of the Ki-84 Hayate, its best response to the Mustang, plummeted month by month. The shortage of steel forced the use of inferior materials. The lack of parts generated aircraft with components of low durability. And, the most serious, pilots were launched into combat with less than 40 hours of flight time. Many had not even fired their weapons in actual training. The comparison became untenable. While the Americans prepared each Mustang with 100-octane fuel, pressurized oil, and calibrated incendiary ammunition, the Japanese tried to fly fighters fueled with synthetic gasoline derived from pine, armed with reused, often unstable, ammunition. In 1945, an internal Japanese report estimated that only 20% of the fighters produced were in full combat condition at the time of delivery. The mathematics of defeat was brutally imposed. For every functional Ki-84 that climbed, 5 Mustangs were already refueled, armed, with a trained pilot, and orders in hand. It was a war that was decided on production curves, not dogfights. American logistics created strategic depth. It could and did lose aircraft, but each loss was absorbed, replaced, and overcome. Japan, by contrast, saw every loss as an irrecoverable whole. Each plane shot down was a destroyed work week. Each pilot killed was an eliminated trainer of future instructors. In July 1945, a Japanese officer noted, "We have aircraft in the hangars, but there is a lack of tires. And those who have tires don't have drivers. And those who have pilots, they don't have fuel." The phrase was not poetic, it was accounting. The Japanese war effort had become a juggling act of lack. And every day, the Mustangs showed that superiority was not just technical, but arithmetic. It was no longer a race, it was a marathon between a faith-driven country and a machine-powered one. And the machines were winning, because the war was no longer about what you could imagine, it was about what could be delivered. And in that delivery, the Americans had a quiet but fatal advantage, a forward base in the middle of the Pacific, which would transform the air warfare equation forever. This base had a name, and his name was Iwo Jima. The real battlefield began before takeoff. In workshops, hangars, parts warehouses. It was there that victory was shaped, only to be executed in heaven. The P-51 Mustang was designed with a clear philosophy: maximum efficiency, minimum complexity. On the ground, that meant less maintenance time, more time in the air. A broken Merlin engine could be removed and replaced in 4 hours by a trained crew. Each piece was standardized, labeled, and stored in logistics warehouses organized by priority of demand. Maintenance followed detailed manuals with tools adapted to the field. On Iwo Jima, Mustangs landed and took off on compacted coral runways, improvised days after the capture of the island. And even in this hostile environment, they operated on 2 missions a day with minimal failure rates. On the other hand, the reality was quite different. The Ki-84 Hayate, even though it was the best Japanese fighter of the war, required manufacturing and assembly tolerances that Japan could no longer sustain. Misaligned axles, failing brakes, hydraulic systems corroded by low-quality alloys. There have been recorded cases of planes breaking their landing gear when touching the runway, even without severe impact. The rate of mechanical failure in the first 30 hours of flight reached 35%. Japanese pilots reported that in certain units, out of every 4 planes available, only 1 was considered safe. The fuel, obtained from improvised synthetic processes, had an unstable octane rating, compromising the performance of the engines. Many pilots climbed already aware that even if they escaped combat, they might not be able to land. This technical insecurity eroded morale as much as enemy fighters. Americans' confidence in their Mustangs was almost silent, not because they considered them invulnerable, but because they knew that if they came back, the plane would be ready again, and fast. Each Mustang had an invisible support network around it: specialized mechanics, spare parts, calibrated instruments, spare tires, guaranteed fuel, stocked ammunition. It was a complete, functional, and continuous chain. In Japan, this chain was broken. Veteran pilots improvised procedures. Instructors taught shortcuts and mechanics reused worn-out components. The Japanese air war was no longer against the enemy. He was against entropy, and entropy won. Meanwhile, the Americans were demonstrating that the real fighting machine wasn't just the fighter. It was the entire system that made it fly, fight, and come back. The victory began on the floor, where the American workshop functioned as an extension of the production line. The same logic that produced cars in Detroit now supported entire squadrons in the Pacific, and that's what terrified the Axis generals. The Americans weren't improvising the war. They were systematizing it. In August 1945, a German officer captured during post-surrender interrogations commented, when asked about the Mustangs, "The scariest thing was not the plane. It was knowing that while you were knocking one down, 5 others were being fueled behind him." In the next part, we will see how this fear would become reality in its most extreme degree, when Mustangs began to fly even over the Imperial Palace, without encountering resistance, because the sky of Japan, once a symbol of divine protection, was about to be taken over by American engines and embarrassing silences. In the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, the American pilot took off with 600 flight hours recorded, training in multiple types of missions, detailed maps, long-range VHF radio, calibrated compass, reliable oxygen system, and above all, the certainty that, if he was shot down, there was a rescue network ready to pick him up, including submarines strategically positioned in the Pacific with the exclusive mission of recovering pilots. He flew knowing that the system supported him until the last second. In 1945, the Japanese pilot ascended to the sky with a backpack of faith and improvisation. Most of the novices had between 40 and 60 hours of instruction, many of them in rudimentary simulators or in unarmed planes. They flew with outdated maps, limited or no radio, compass often miscalibrated by magnetic interference from the fuselage, unstable oxygen, fogged visors, and in most cases no real expectation of returning. At some bases, instructors warned, "If the plane fails, die with honor." It was not rhetoric. It was the doctrine. On the ground, there was no fuel left for searches, nor aircraft available to cover rescues. The pilot who fell into the sea died. What was lost in the clouds disappeared, and what came back injured was treated with what was left. Machine and man shared the same fate: exhaustion. The difference was that, on the other side, machine and man were sustained by a technical ecosystem unthinkable to the Japanese. In every Mustang there was an equation: man plus machine plus system. A pilot trained to identify targets, operate instruments accurately, communicate in a network, receive real-time instructions, and operate as part of a larger organism. In Japan, each pilot was an isolated individual, often without even knowing the position of his colleagues in the air. The discipline existed, but without logistical support, and heroism in these cases was a form of desperation. In direct confrontations, Japanese pilots attempted daring maneuvers, frontal attacks, suicide dives, not for tactical advantage, but because they knew their chances of returning were slim. It was bravery, forced by the absence of alternatives. And this is where war becomes more than numbers. It turns into a human tragedy, because while the world looked at the sky and saw airplanes, what really went up were boys. Some were 19 years old, others without beards, many with their training cut short by urgency. In contrast, Americans trained pilots with months of training, access to simulators, constant revisions, and above all, feedback. Each mission was analyzed, every bug corrected, each casualty studied. Learning was continuous. The Japanese, on the other hand, erased the names of the fallen with a brush and moved on. There was no time for technical autopsies, and the result was the collapse of an entire generation. By February 1945, only 37% of Japanese pilots assigned to interception missions completed more than 3 flights. Most died, disappeared, or were incapacitated before reaching 10 hours of actual combat. For comparison, the average American pilot completed between 30 and 50 missions before being rotated or promoted. A devastating difference. One statistic that the Germans ignored when predicting Japanese collapse was the number of American-trained pilots. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. trained more than 193,000 military pilots, almost 10 times more than Germany and Japan combined. If this number impressed you, comment below. Shocking data. Because the war at that time was no longer about who had the most courage. It was about who had the most pilots alive to tell the tale. And the Japanese, little by little, stopped having them. In the next part, we'll look at how American air dominance not only secured victories in the sky, but reconfigured the map of the Pacific itself, turning isolated islands into operational strongholds, and Japan into an uncovered target. What would come next was not just bombing, it was strategic air occupation, and the Mustangs would be the sentinels of this new era. In March 1945, for the first time in history, the sky over Tokyo ceased to be Japanese, not only by symbolic presence, but by total occupation. Escorting the silver B-29 Colossi, the Mustangs emerged in close formation, low, fast, and lethal. Its propellers cut through the air with authority. There were no more safe zones. Railway stations, supply trains, small lanes, and even coastal villages were swept away in broad daylight. And the most brutal, it was no longer necessary to bomb en masse. Their presence was enough. Each flyby was a calculated display of dominance, as if the Americans were saying without words that they could now go where they wanted, when they wanted, and back intact. For the Japanese people, accustomed to state censorship and invincibility propaganda, it was like waking up inside a broken lie. Children saw trains being hit. Workers saw explosions meters from their factories. Families heard the dry sound of 50 cutting off the previously quiet mornings. There was no longer any way to hide. The empire was exposed. Captain Masaru Yoshida of the 56th Sentai wrote in his diary on April 9th, "The war is lost, and we're just waiting to die. Heaven does not belong to us. Time does not belong to us. Only the orders keep coming." This was no longer the account of a soldier. It was the confession of an entire system collapsing. Because when the sky of your capital is patrolled by foreign machines, your sovereignty no longer exists. What remained was silence, automatic orders, and a cold wait for the inevitable. And in the next chapter of this story, we will see how this wait was filled with an even more ruthless strategy. Precision strikes against factories, mills, and infrastructure, where the real heart of the Japanese resistance would finally be targeted, not with 1,000-kilogram bombs, but with the surgical logic of systematic destruction. Imperial Japan believed in spirits. He believed in the divine wind, the kamikaze that centuries earlier would have saved the nation from Mongol invasion, and that now, in 1945, was reborn as the official doctrine of sacrifice. Young people trained to die, planes converted into human projectiles, entire commandos prepared to turn their own bodies into weapons. It was the ultimate expression of Japanese military faith, the belief that voluntary death, when guided by honor and duty, could reverse the course of war. But at the same time that these rituals were solemnly performed, the Mustangs flew. They flew without emotion. They flew with a map, fuel, plan of attack, and calculated margin of error. They flew like part of a gear, and that was the hardest blow. The spiritual sacrifice laden with tears and promises collided with the statistical coldness of the enemy. While a kamikaze pilot said his final prayer before takeoff, an American pilot consulted the alternative return route and checked the fuel level for the third time. While a Japanese man said goodbye to his family with a flag tied around his neck, an American discussed the ideal engine temperature at cruising altitude. The war had changed. Tragic heroism, however powerful, could not compete with industrial repetition, because in the end, what fell most from the sky over Japan was not a bomb. It was logical. Every Mustang that crossed Japanese airspace carried the same message. We have more, we fly farther, we return safely, and we will do it again tomorrow. The nation that had hoped for miracles now saw its territory overflown by planes that operated like clocks. They were not heroes, they were pieces, and every replaceable part. The very idea of war as individual sacrifice has been eroded, because when the enemy does not need to die to win, his martyrdom loses meaning. And the Japanese began to realize this. The symbol of his maximum effort, the kamikaze, was answered by a machine that didn't even need to be celebrated. It was just another shift, another flight, another target. In June 1945, a Japanese colonel, in an internal report, wrote, "They do not shout, they do not challenge, they do not pray, they just fly. And when they return, others come. We are dying to stop gears." If that wasn't enough, the Mustangs still pierced the sacred sky of the archipelago. They flew over ancestral mountains, passed over Shinto shrines, drew invisible lines on the ground that until months before was considered inviolable. The space that the emperors claimed was guarded by the gods was now pierced by 50-caliber machine guns. The myth of the divine wind had been dispelled by mass-produced propellers and armor-piercing projectiles fired with gyroscopic sights. No ritual, no devotion, no ancestral cry could stop the precision of an American assembly line. Japan's spiritual warfare had collided with the mechanical age of the West, and in the collision between faith and repetition, faith bled more. In the next part, we'll understand how this symbolic collapse translated into desperate decisions, and how the last Japanese pilots were sent into combat with suicide orders, not for glory, but for lack of an alternative. Because when all else fails, even death becomes a tool, and the Mustangs were ready for it. In 1945, many Japanese pilots died without even seeing the enemy. The reports are repeated in the diaries and records of air units. Alarms sounded, fighter jets were activated, men ran to the hangars with interception orders. But by the time the aircraft took off, the first shots were already cutting the sky. Mustangs, flying with prior air intelligence, accurate weather data, and altitude superiority, chose where, when, and how to engage. It was the end of dueling as a military concept. The romantic idea of two pilots meeting face to face, crossing eyes in the open sky, maneuvering in spirals to the limit of the body and the machine, had been replaced by a new ritual, that of aerial execution. The P-51s didn't go into combat. They finished. With their radios tuned in real time to tactical commands, they coordinated attacks in pairs, approaching their targets from above, with angular advantage and accumulated kinetic energy. A dive, a gust, a retreat. They were rarely seen before firing. Each Mustang carried nearly 2,000 rounds of M2 Browning .50 ammunition, capable of piercing armor, fuel tanks, and cutting through control surfaces with precision. The K-14 gyro sight, introduced in the latest models, automatically calculated the future point of the target based on the speed and angle of approach. On the other hand, Japanese fighters still used fixed optical displays, requiring manual and instinctive calculation in mid-flight. The difference was brutal. While an American aimed with an algorithm, a Japanese bet on luck, and this luck was running out faster and faster. Many of the recorded clashes lasted no more than 20 seconds. On missions over Kyushu and Honshu, American pilots report shooting down as many as 3 enemies in a single dive, even before Japanese fighters could form defensive patterns. The Japanese tactical doctrine itself, based on group maneuvers and close combat, became useless in the face of the speed, altitude, and range of the Mustangs, and what remained, in the end, were the wreckage. On the ground, Japanese mechanics picked up fuselages studded with dozens of 50 impacts. Often planes crashed without even firing once. It was no longer combat, it was slaughter. Military historian Katsuhiro Tsukamoto, in reviewing reports from April 1945, wrote, "There was no battle. There was a sentence. Takeoff was the beginning of the end." Ballistics confirmed it. Out of every 10 clashes recorded, 7 ended without an exchange of fire. Only one side fired, and always with mathematical precision. Japanese ammunition, when used, proved ineffective. The combination of low quantity available, manufacturing flaws, and absence of tracers further reduced the chances of success. In contrast, Mustangs flew incendiary, explosive, and armor-piercing ammunition, arranged in alternating patterns to maximize damage per impact. And there was still another invisible factor: morale. When the pilot knows that his weapon fails, his aim is inferior, and his enemy has the advantage of the first shot, he is already defeated before he goes up. The commander of the 244th Sentai, after losing 10 aircraft in a single morning, declared, "We are no longer flying to fight. We are flying to show that we have not run away." The war there had lost its confrontational essence. It had become one-sided, as if a metal fist repeatedly crushed an unarmed body. If the Mustang's goal was to impose total domination, it was achieved. But the psychological toll to the Japanese was incalculable. Many veterans avoid talking about this phase to this day, because there is a difference between dying in combat and being shot down before combat exists, and that difference marks the line between war and collapse. In the next part, we will dive into this very point, when even the airfields became traps, because the Mustangs didn't just control the skies, they turned Japanese soil into denied territory, and the pilots, even on the ground, were already in the crosshairs. On the morning of June 1, 1945, A formation of P-51 Mustangs took off from Iwo Jima bound for Osaka. The mission was routine, escorting B-29s in an attack on the city's industrial centers. In all, 148 fighters took off. No Japanese air resistance was expected. The American command predicted another day of undisputed superiority. But the war, on that day, would be fought against an invisible enemy, and unstoppable. On the way to the target, the formation came across a weather system that was not in the forecasts. A cluster of rapidly growing cumulonimbus clouds, loaded with electricity, turbulence, and zero visibility. The Mustangs, flying in tight squadrons, entered the white chaos without knowing what awaited them. Within the clouds, the world disappeared. The compass rotated without direction. The wings trembled under unpredictable gusts. The fire of St. Elmo, electric sparks dancing on metal surfaces, took the wingtips and propellers. Pilots would later report that the radio silence was cut off only by screams, static and dry crashing sounds. The formation, which until minutes before had been flying in geometric discipline, broke like glass. When he came out of the storm, what was left was fragment and absence. In less than 40 minutes, 27 Mustangs were gone. None of them were shot down by enemies, all swallowed by the atmosphere. Clouds, water, wind, confusion. Some fell into the sea, others collided in midair, others simply did not reappear. The command recorded the episode as Black Friday, a bitter irony for a war that seemed so controlled. Because on that day, the power of industry, technology, and logistics succumbed to natural instability. There was no technical failure, human error, or enemy tactical surprise. Just a reminder that even the most accurate system still relies on variables that no engineer can contain. And it was at this point that the war revealed another type of vulnerability, that of those who win. The Americans, accustomed to the ruthless efficiency of their methods, saw in that episode the face of randomness. Of the 27 missing pilots, only 8 were rescued alive. The rest became numbers, and then silence. A forgotten statistic among so many victories, but a real statistic, and necessary. Because even a fighter manufactured every 66 minutes is not indestructible. Even a pilot with 600 hours of flight time is not invulnerable. And even a system that dominates the sky can still be brought down by a moving air mass. For Japanese strategists, this episode was seen with a mixture of incredulity and hope. They had not won, but they had seen the giant stumble. Still, they couldn't take advantage of it. Its radars did not detect the collapse. Their fighters did not fly. Their commanders did not know, because they no longer controlled the sky, the earth, or the weather. And even though the weather won that day, the war did not stop. Over the next few days, the Mustangs returned. They reformed, reorganized, flew. The gear continued, and Japan once again saw silver propellers over its cities, a continual reminder that while heaven still held dangers, it was the earth that was crumbling. If this data surprised you, 27 Mustangs lost in a single day, with no enemy fire. Comment below, giants also fall, because even in war, the unexpected finds loopholes. And in the next part, we'll look at how, even in the face of losses like this, the Americans imposed a new kind of control, the systematic cancellation of Japanese airfields, turning every runway into a death trap. Because true aerial dominance doesn't end in the air. It starts on the ground. In the heart of the air war, far from radars, machine guns, and bombs, was a silent battlefield, the cockpit. It was there, surrounded by metal, glass, and atmospheric pressure, that the pilot fought the most intimate combat, against fear, discomfort, error. And it was in this detail, almost invisible from a distance, that the P-51 Mustang offered an advantage as decisive as its speed or firepower. Because Mustang wasn't just designed to fly. It was designed to protect the mind of those who flew. The ergonomics of its cockpit obeyed an almost surgical functionalist logic. Each lever, dial, button, and pedal was positioned according to studies of visual range, muscle response, and cognitive clarity. The seat, adjustable in height and inclination, allowed the pilot to maintain full visibility even under violent maneuvers. The primary instruments, artificial horizon altimeter, compass, speedometer, and rate of climb indicator, were clustered in the central field of view, illuminated by soft, anti-glare light. The radio, which was simplified to operate, had a touch selection lever and immediate response. Even the cabin heating system took into account the altitude and the pilot's resistance to the cold. A driver who breathes better sees better. A driver who feels safe reacts more accurately. And perhaps most symbolically, the Mustang had a rudimentary but functional system of physiological relief for long missions, decompression tubes and sanitary bags. It may seem irrelevant, but when you spend 6 hours at altitude, human biology becomes a tactical factor. On the Japanese Ki-84 Hayate, the cabin told a different story. Developed in haste and under severe industrial constraints, the fighter had a cramped internal structure, redundant controls, vibration-impaired instrument reading, and a virtually zero rear field of view. The glass of the cockpit distorted the side edges. The visor of the visor reflected light at certain angles, and the absence of thermal insulation caused the hands to freeze at 25,000 feet. In simple terms, the machine demanded more from man than it could offer in return. And this accumulated mental wear and tear knocked pilots down before the battle began. Captain Takashi Hirose, a veteran of 42 missions, reported after the war, "The plane flew like a strong animal, but it didn't care if you could see or breathe." The phrase sums up the doctrinal abyss. While the Americans treated the pilot as a central part of the combat system, the Japanese still saw the man as a servant of the machine. The result? In identical conditions of stress, low visibility, sharp turn, temporary loss of pressure, the American pilot reacted more effectively, not because he was better, but because his aircraft treated him better. The layout of the Mustang reduced response time, reduced errors, and above all combated panic. And in the sky, where 3 seconds decide life or death, ergonomics is weaponry. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about performance, survival, of decision. Because the rider who sees faster, breathes steadily, and feels that his fingers reach everything they need without thinking, that pilot comes back, and he comes back to fly again. The engineering of the P-51 didn't just shield the hull, it shielded the psychological. And that's why, even facing fast fighters, anti-aircraft fighters, and aggressive maneuvers, American pilots kept pace. They had time, they had visibility, they had control. They had a place to rest their elbows, where to fix their eyes, and where to escape. And when you add up these millimeters of advantage, an eternity of survival is formed. In the war of nerves, the Mustang was the plane that most protected the brain, and therefore it was the plane that brought the most bodies back. In the next part, we will explore what happened after landing. Because the Mustang didn't finish its mission on landing, it began another, being rearmed, refueled, overhauled, and rerouted in less than an hour. And in this cycle, where machines regenerate like soldiers, American supremacy reached its logistical apex. Get ready to enter the hangars, where the silence of maintenance was more lethal than 1,000 screams on the radio. In order for a single Mustang to cross the Pacific, escort bombers to Japan and back, hundreds of people and countless invisible cogs had to work with surgical precision. The image of the lone fighter tearing through the skies masked the stark reality. Each VLR mission, very long range, was a continental logistics operation. It began at the airfields of Iwo Jima, but its roots were in refineries in Texas, factories in Detroit, supply centers in Hawaii, and radio broadcasts in California. High-octane jet fuel, refined specifically to maximize Merlin engine performance, crossed oceans in destroyer-protected convoys, and fueled underground depots on blood and steel-filled islands. The ammunition, each 50 shell, polished, heavy, balanced, came in monthly shipments coordinated by consumption spreadsheets per squad. There were always more bullets than targets, more fuel tanks than missions, and more trained pilots than available seats. Each Mustang, as it took off, carried not only its pilot, but also the silent assurance that it would have supplies, parts, drinking water, a marine survival kit, radio contacts, and, in the event of a crash, submarines on patrol for rescue. That's right, submarines positioned in advance to save downed pilots. A VLR mission was preceded by weather reconnaissance flights with unarmed planes, just to map out the optimal weather route. The data was processed by analysts on the ground, who redirected the mission in real time. All this so that a fighter would fly for 1,500 kilometers, fire for less than 30 seconds, and come back. Japan, on the other hand, was operating in the midst of collapse. Its fuel came from improvised distillation of vegetable oils, liquid coal, or, in the final stages, from unstable chemical sources that damaged engines. Spare parts were torn from damaged planes, in a process of systematic cannibalization. Pilots flew with incomplete survival gear, limited range radios, no up-to-date maps and instructions based on hypotheses, not consolidated intelligence. There were missions in which it was not known if there would be fuel for the return. There were bombed runways being patched with bamboo and rusty metal plates. The war that was seen in the air was only the reflection of an underground truth. Japan had already lost on the ground, because the Mustang wasn't just a machine. It was the end product of an interdependent network of factories, transportation, information, maintenance, and reserves. And this network was the real engine of American victory. While Japan spent energy trying to save face, the U.S. multiplied gears. The war turned into a game of scale. For every Mustang shot down, there was another ready. With each mission launched, a second one was planned. And if a squad failed, the statistics swallowed it up. The Americans could make mistakes because their logistics gave them leeway. The Japanese always needed to get it right because they would not have second chances. And this imbalance, cumulative, has become unbearable. Major Akihiro Naito, a logistics officer for the Japanese Air Force, wrote in a report, "We do not fight pilots. We fight spreadsheets. And they don't bleed." A phrase that sums up the war as it really was. Not of honor, but of structure. Not of courage, but of calculation. If this comparison seems disproportionate, it is because it was. Mustangs flew because there was an entire continent flying with them, and on the other side, Japan was trying to hold the sky with the strength of its hands. In the next part, we'll cross the final limits of the map, the longest, riskiest, and most unlikely missions, where even the pilots doubted they would be able to make it back, because the Mustang's range wasn't just geographical. It was a warning. There is no safe place. In the official register, there are 85 names. P-51 Mustang pilots who departed from the coral runways of Iwo Jima and never returned. They did not fall in combat. They were overcome by clouds, mechanical failures, inaccurate coordinates, fatigue. Most have disappeared into the absolute blue of the Pacific, where the horizon blends with the abyss. Men trained to the extreme, flying precision machines, disappearing on routes where there was no margin for error. Its VLR missions lasted up to 8 hours. And in this interval there was no pause, no breath, just the continuous tension of keeping attention, checking instruments, controlling fuel consumption, calculating wind, planning every minute of the lap. Many carried hand-drawn maps attached to their knees. Others folded tickets in the inside pocket of the flight jacket, letters that would not be read, because it wasn't the enemy that overthrew them, it was the sacrifice. Fly 1,500 kilometers over the ocean, escort bombers, face anti-aircraft fire, then turn around and retrace the entire route, alone, with the constant noise of the Merlin engine as the only company, not knowing if the island would still be visible at the end of the day. In his diaries, frankness is disarming. The noise of the sea is more frightening than the sound of machine guns, wrote Lieutenant Bill Ramsey, 2 days before his last mission. Another, Captain James Oliver, reported, "Sometimes I look at the water and think if the engine stops now, that's it. End." And for many it was. The sea did not return bodies, only absence. The families received telegrams, missing in action, nothing more. Names engraved on bronze plates. But each of these absences sustained the American air presence over Japan. Each driver who did not return contributed to others returning. This is the silent mathematics of war. Victory is built on the sacrifice of those who could not celebrate it. And even with all the technology, with all the logistics, with all the systems, there was always the human factor: exhaustion, loneliness, fear. The Mustang was fast, powerful, reliable, but he was not invincible, and its pilots knew it. Even so, they took off. Mission after mission, an 8-hour flight with only 20 minutes of combat. The rest was waiting, watchfulness, calculation, and faith. The faith that the sky would not close, that the fuel would be enough, that the engine would not fail. The faith that, in the end, there would be a clue, and someone waiting. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Japan trusted the spirit. The U.S. trusted the system. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because behind every piece of data there is a face, and behind each face a story that deserves to be told. In the next part, we will reveal what the Japanese generals themselves wrote in their diaries in the last months of the war. Internal confessions, sealed and filed, which show the exact moment when even the strategists of the empire admitted, "We are no longer fighting. We are just postponing the inevitable." On the morning of August 10, 1945, the wings of Mustangs once again cut through the Japanese sky. The mission was clear. Fly over the main remaining airfields of the empire, identify hostile movements and, if necessary, attack. But what they found was something more disturbing than resistance: emptiness. No fighter went up, no radar activated an alert, no opposing formation tried to intercept. The air, once the scene of desperate combats and kamikaze sorties, now hung mutely. The Imperial Air Force, once a symbol of prestige, honor, and technical power, had simply ceased to exist as a functional force. The hangars had their doors open, many already destroyed by previous attacks. On the runways, charred fuselages, dismantled fighters for lack of parts, and shadows of planes that would never take off. Inside the bases, boys just over 16 years old, hastily summoned, received instructions with a solemn but useless tone. Most had never completed even 40 hours of flight. They had in their eyes the reverence taught by the instructors, but in their muscles the inexperience of those who still barely knew the wind. There was a lack of fuel. There was a lack of ammunition. There was a lack of command. The radios were muted. The orders no longer came. And deep down everyone knew, going up would be suicide. Not for the glory, but for nothingness. Because the enemy now flew in cold, precise, repeated formation. The Mustangs would enter the airspace, make their rounds, register their absence, and set off. The empire of the rising sun, which had started the war by summoning the divine winds of legend, now saw its sky dominated without a single shot being fired. It was the end, but without an explosion. An end without sound. The extinction of a doctrine, of a faith. In the internal diaries of the senior officers, the resignation was coldly recorded. General Jun Ushiroku, head of the 12th Army Area, noted, "The only resistance we can put up right now is ideological, because in the material field, there are no wings left." What had begun as a triumphant offensive at Pearl Harbor ended like this, with empty hangars, airmen flightless, and the continuous sound of Mustangs watching, with impunity, the defeated capital. The air war in Japan did not end with an epic duel between aces. It ended with the absence of combat, with the surrender of the air even before the surrender on paper. And it was this absence that signaled more clearly than any proclamation that the empire had lost. Not because there was a lack of bravery, but because logic, steel, and fuel had won. In the next and penultimate part, we will walk through the silent halls of the Imperial General Headquarters and open the archives where generals have recorded, often in code or metaphor, the harshest confession a strategist can make. We fought as far as the machine would allow. After that, all that was left was the wait. On the morning of August 15, 1945, as Tokyo fell silent under the broadcast of Emperor Hirohito's voice announcing the surrender, 2 Mustangs still streaked across the sky in tight formation over Japan. They were piloted by Lieutenant Jerry Yellen and young Philip Schlamberg, only 19 years old. The mission had left before the official confirmation of the ceasefire. The plan was to hit remaining targets in northern Honshu. The war for them was still real. Communication failed, or came too late. During the return, already over the sea, black smoke cut through the formation. Schlamberg's Mustang had been hit by light anti-aircraft fire, possibly fired by an isolated battery, ignorant of orders from above. Or maybe it was just the cruel fate of those who survived the war, but not its end. Schlamberg did not respond to the radio. His fighter went into a dive and disappeared into the waves. No rescue was possible. He had turned 19 just a few weeks earlier, and his name would enter the records as the last American pilot killed in combat in World War II. Jerry Yellen, the leader of the mission, would return alone. Upon landing, he was informed that the war had ended while in the air. "We fought until the last minute," one officer said. But for Yellen, that phrase would never mean pride, only mourning. Philip did not die for victory. He died because of the delay of a statement. It died in the gap between political decision and operational reality. A failure of minutes cost a lifetime, and this final detail dismantles any glorious narrative. It shows that even the war won charges interest, not in territory but in forgotten names. Schlamberg had flown dozens of missions. It escaped anti-aircraft fire, survived combat against Japanese fighters, defied weather, distance, and fatigue. But he did not survive the peace, and this irony is unbearable. In his letters there were simple dreams: to return home, to study engineering, perhaps to learn to play the piano. He never held them, because the time of war is not precise. It extends between orders, through radio noises, through radars turned off too late. Yellen, remembering that day, said that she would carry that flight forever, not as a mission, but as a lament. The last takeoff of the American war ended with silence. There was no celebration on the track, just the weight of understanding that even when everything ends, you still die. In the next part, we will see what was left in the eyes of the vanquished, the Japanese pilots who, without flying, watched the end. Men who expected to die in combat but survived to understand what it meant to see their sky occupied, and to be able to do nothing. Today, more than 80 years later, it is still possible to hear the sound of Mustangs, not in combat but in ceremonies, air shows, living museums where the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, manufactured under license by Packard, still roars with the same cadence as in 1945. Of the more than 15,000 P-51s produced, hundreds survived. Many have been restored. They fly in formation over peaceful capitals with civilian pilots wearing leather jackets in honor of those who have departed. The Mustang has become a symbol, not just air power, but permanence, a machine that has crossed time. Japan, on the other hand, preserved only one original Ki-84 Hayate in public display condition. He is standing at the Peace Museum in Chiran. It doesn't fly. It doesn't roar. It doesn't shine. It is surrounded by flowers and signs with the names of young riders who have never returned. It's an airplane that doesn't celebrate. He regrets it. It represents not glory, but the absence of it. The contrast is brutal. On the one hand, the material legacy converted into national pride. On the other, the mechanical ghost that echoes a lost generation. The P-51 became an archetype of victory with sound and movement. The Hayate, an epitaph of silence and contemplation. Both survived, but only one flies. This symbolic difference reveals more than any treaty. The United States not only won the war, but organized the memory of the victory. Museums, manuals, spare parts, historical collections, a whole structure dedicated to telling, maintaining, and repeating. Japan preserved the pain, and with it, the lesson, because a people who remember the trauma, even if silently, do not allow it to be repeated easily. There is an ethical dimension to this. The Americans domesticated their planes. They made them pieces of a heroic past. The Japanese kept theirs as an alert, as an open wound. In both cases, the story lives on, but under different tones. The Mustangs still take to the sky as if to say, we won because we planned, because we built, because we kept flying the impossible. The Ki-84, on the other hand, remains static, as if whispering, we fought beyond what we could, and now we know the cost. One was made to continue, the other, never to be forgotten. And if there is something that connects the two, it is the technical and moral lesson that survives any nationality. Victory does not belong only to the strongest, but to the most prepared. In the next and final chapter, we'll tie that story together, with numbers, names, and an uncomfortable truth. The sound of 50 machine guns over Tokyo was not just the signature of Japanese defeat, but the herald of a new era in which steel, production, and science would determine the fate of nations. When the Mustang's engines fell silent and the Japanese hangars became silent ruins, what remained was not just the memory of an aerial confrontation, but the brutal evidence of an ideological collapse. Japan, forged in codes of honor, traditions, and individual bravery, bet that the spirit could stand up to the machine. But in that sky over Tokyo, what prevailed was not the bravery of the drivers, but the precision of the factories. Every P-51D that crossed the imperial skies carried more than fuel and ammunition. It carried an industrial chain that began with Pennsylvania coal, passed through the Chicago rails, and ended in the logic of Detroit engineers. It was America on the move, and Japan, isolated in its beliefs and constrained by its geography, discovered too late that one does not fight against mathematics. Because in modern warfare, courage without production is martyrdom, honor without logistics is despair, and the battlefield is not won at the moment of the shot, but years before in the technical drawing, in the forged steel, in the translated manual, in the spare part that arrives on time. The great lesson is as simple as it is devastating. Whoever understands that the war is won in the rear, wins in the front line. And as much as the reports eternalize the duel between fighters in the skies of the Pacific, the naked truth remains. The Mustangs did not beat the Hayates. American industry beat Japan. As German General Alfred Jodl confessed at the end of the war, looking at the maps and numbers, we were defeated by trucks. If you value this detailed historical analysis and believe that facts like this need to be told with clarity and respect, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is vital for us to continue unraveling the invisible gears of history. And comment, what was the most shocking fact of this documentary for you? Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Because war, as you saw today, is not just about battles, but about decisions, structures, and ideas. And they are still among us. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.